Piero Molino, creator of Ludwig.ai and previously a senior research scientist at Uber AI. Welcome to the Data Exchange podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Ben.
So as I recall, probably some of the first industry talks about Ludwig occurred at conferences I chaired, Strata and O'Reilly AI.
Yeah.
And I wanted you here on the show because the new version of Ludwig just came out. So first of all, what is Ludwig?
So Ludwig is a tool that allows users to train deep learning models and then using them for obtaining predictions, all without having to write code. What users have to do is to provide a really simple declarative definition configuration of the models that they want to train. And Ludwig will do the job for them of preprocessing, training them, building them, and then also potentially serving them so that it makes it more accessible to a wider audience than the usual people that will implement TensorFlow or PyTorch code by themselves.
So when Ludwig was first released, I think you recorded the video, right?
Yeah, so actually
explaining what it was,
that,
and the way you talked about it was you actually built Ludwig for yourself.
that is true. That is true. Yeah. Initially, I was working on a project called Kota that was a customer support model that we developed internally at Uber. Which I mean, there's a bunch of articles online if you're interested to know more about it. And so the idea was that initially it was a text classification problem. So I built a model for text classification, but then the product manager came to me saying, oh, that there's new features that we can leverage here. For instance, we can know something about the user that is sending this ticket. And so there were new features to introduce. And then I added them, and then there was new features that were introduced again about the ride that the user were taking while they provided the ticket. And also then it became a multitask problem because we wanted the same model to provide multiple predictions on multiple tasks. And so basically I built a tool for myself because I'm a really lazy person. And whenever there is problem that I have to solve more than twice, I try to create a generic structure that allows me to really fast, to be really fast at creating the next version of the problem or solving that problem again. And so I made it so that it would simplify my own life in adding new features to deep learning models and to adding new tasks to deep learning models, and also to compare different possible deep learning models on the same data sets to have a fair comparison and figuring out which are the models that end up being used in production in the end.
But as I understand it, you also created the Ludwig. You created Ludwig so that it was it also became
immediately
useful for people who are not researchers like yourself, right?
Yeah.
So in the sense that you think of a typical data scientist in a company, maybe they don't have a lot of images to analyze, but they do have a lot of text. They do have a lot of structured data. So Ludwig is useful for all sorts of machine learning problems, right?
Yeah. So that's one of the basic principles. When I started working on Ludwig, and when I started to see like new features coming in, I made this design decision to make it general so that you could do many different tasks. In particular, the level of abstraction that I introduced is based on the data type. So when you provide an input to Ludwig, you can also specify which data type it belongs to. And so Ludwig does a bunch of things differently depending on the data type. Does different pre-processing, does different encoding, does different decoding, and does the different post-processing based on the data type. And also the measures and the losses that are used for evaluating the models change depending on the data type. And because of this level of abstraction, Ludwig can be used by many different users for many different tasks. And after, actually, even before releasing it, when I was using it internally at the company at Uber, there were a bunch of people that started using it for tasks that were different from the one that I initially envisioned, or at least initially started using it for. And that was actually one of the reasons that convinced me that open sourcing it would be a good idea, because I thought that there was a relatively large community out there of data scientists and machine learning engineers that would be really, for whom Ludwig would be really useful.
So Piero, have you heard if, let's say, individual data scientists of by that I mean people who work on laptops and typically use scikit-learn, would Ludwig be also an appropriate tool for people like that, or do you feel that Ludwig is better suited for people who have access to a cluster?
Well, let me give you some context here. So first of all, Ludwig has some integrations with other tools like Horabot, for instance, that allow you to run the training in parallel in a distributed way on a cluster. And one of the new features that we introduced in version 0.3 is a feature for hyperparameter optimization. And one of the executors that we have is based on Fiber, which is, again, another open source project that allow you to run tasks in a cluster, a Kubernetes cluster. Like you can do hyperparameter optimization by training a different model on several different machines. So Ludwig is treated for those kind of use cases. At the same time, depending on the size of data that you have, and also depending on the specific tasks that you are trying to solve, it could be more or less suited also for the data scientists working from their laptops. To give you a context, also, I mean, Ludwig trains deep learning models. So there are some contexts, in particular around tabular data, where deep learning models are currently not the best solution. And so for those tasks, I would advise people to use the best in breed solutions for those tasks. But where Ludwig shines is where you have some sort of multimodal data. For instance, you have some text data, but you also have some additional fields that are super useful signals for your prediction task. Or maybe you have images and other fields, or a mix of images, text, and some other perceptual kind of data. Those tasks are the ones where Ludwig shines because it makes it really easy for you to mix and match different data types and obtaining predictions right off the bat. Not sure that the laptop is the best place where to run those tasks, but maybe you can run them on Colab with some GPUs and you're maybe happy with that.
So you used the word declarative. So does that mean an analyst would be able to use Ludwig?
So let me put it this way. Ludwig is also, one of the other design principles is flexibility. And with flexibility, I mean that what I try to make in terms of, again, the declarative nature of the definition of the model is flexible to the extent that someone who doesn't know the nitty-gritty details about deep learning models can use the defaults or run some hyperparameter optimizations to figure out which architecture or which parameters are actually best suited for their use cases. But on the other hand, if there's someone who is more expert and knows the nitty-gritty details of the deep learning models that they want to train, they can change all the little parameters, all the knobs of the models, for instance, some architectural parameters or some training parameters and so on. So there's value for both the less experienced and the more experienced users. And actually, the real experienced users can also add their own models within Ludwig so that all the parameters of those models then are tunable from the declarative model configuration. For the data analyst in particular, I think that Ludwig at the moment is probably not perfectly suited for the average data analyst because of the fact that although it removes a lot of the complexity, or at least hides the complexity if you don't want to deal with it, there's still a certain amount of knowledge that you need to have if you want to squeeze the performance from your predictive models that you are hoping for. But on the roadmap for Ludwig is centered around the idea of going towards that kind of user that is less knowledgeable about the details of the models, but still you want to on the roadmap we have that we want to provide them with more easier ways to obtain value out of Ludwig.
So give us a sense of the community of contributors? So is it mostly people inside Uber? Obviously, you're not Uber anymore, but so what is the community around Ludwig at the moment?
So it's a really, let's say, peculiar, I would say. I mean, I don't have a lot of experience with many other open source projects, but I believe that the community around Ludwig is pretty peculiar because it's a kind of interesting mix of people at different levels of machine learning expertise. So there are, on one hand, some researchers that are using Ludwig because it provides them with a kind of really easy way to both have baselines for their model, to which compare against for their models, and also provides a way to have a really straightforward and comparable way to train models. So again, they can add their own their own text encoder or their own image encoder to the mix of what is available to Ludwig, and then all the rest is taken care of for them. So that makes it so that they can concentrate on the modeling side of things and not on the data preprocessing or all the other aspects that are involved in training a deep learning model. But at the same time, there's a bunch of people that are more some of them are even on the product side, so they are contributing things in terms of the application interface, and they are suggesting how to make the application interface even simpler. Ludwig has both an programmatic API, very simple programmatic API, and a command line interface, and so it is improving over time thanks to the feedback from those users that are really less sophisticated in terms of
and by the way, I always remind people you can contribute to open source projects even at with documentation.
Absolutely. So that's I would say in the last probably 6 months or so, we had, I think, about 80 to 90 people contributing to Ludwig as a whole, as a project, of which some people contributed on the documentation, some people contributed just even little things like fixing typos in the documentation, that those are really much appreciated. And then there's a more, let's say, smaller set of 15, 20 core contributors that are contributing more on the code side and more on the internals of the system. Usually it's like a spectrum. So you usually, if you want to contribute, you start from contributing some little things, and then gradually you get you increase your familiarity with the code base, and you try to, your contributions become more and more at a low level in terms of the code base. So don't be scared. If you're interested in contributing to an open source project, start small and then gradually build up if you're interested.
So you also use the word deploy. But is it fair to say, Piero, that Ludwig starts after you've already prepared your data?
Yeah, so Ludwig provides you some data pre-processing and post-processing capabilities, but those are not where most of the value of Ludwig lies in.
So you start with some data already that you can point to, and then, okay, so walk us through the entire part of the pipeline that Ludwig covers.
Yeah, so you provide to Ludwig some data in a tabular form. Again, in version 0.3, we have many more data types. You can have, CSVs, TSVs, Parquet, JSON format. Most of the data types, data formats that are supported by something like Pandas are also supported in Ludwig, basically. And Ludwig does some basic data preprocessing, like fills empty values, does some normalization if you instruct it to, does some tokenization for text data type, or for instance for images, does some rescaling, and all these basic things are already done. If you want to do more than that, you can either add it to the Ludwig pipeline, or you could do it beforehand if you want to do really more sophisticated kind of preprocessing. Then, so Ludwig preprocesses the data and then provides it to a model training pipeline that in the end saves the upper parameters of the model and also the weights of the model. And so what happens at test time or prediction time is that the data is preprocessed in the same way that was preprocessed at training time, because we save some mappings. Like for instance, you want to map from strings to integers if you have a categorical column in your data. And so those same mappings are applied to the new data that comes at prediction time. And after the data is transformed, then it's provided as input to the model that is loaded from the weights and hyperparameters that were trained at training time. The model produces some scores and some predictions that are then mapped back in data space by doing some post-processing. For instance, the model produces category 1, and you produce, what name of the class was associated with category 1.
So Ludwig is doing the batch scoring, so it's got a model serving capability?
So there's 3 ways to serve Ludwig models at the moment. One way is there is like a serve command. It's just Ludwig serve and the path to the trained Ludwig model that you have. And so it spawns like a REST API built with a fast API, if you're familiar with that. And so you can, send, REST.
So it's an API endpoint.
Exactly. That's what it spawns. So that's one of the ways. Ludwig also can export their model, Ludwig model, into a neuropod, which is a format that allows you to basically encapsulates a bunch of both Python and tensor computation all in one, kind of package that then you can load and produce predictions from at a really high throughput because it's all C++ stuff. And you can also save a Ludwig model in a saved model format, which is a TensorFlow 2 model format. That there's a caveat with that, is that the saved model, you will have to do the pre-processing and post-processing that I was telling you about on your own if you want to use the saved model. But Ludwig also has a pre-processing and post-processing API that you can use if you want to do that.
So I'm sure you've given a lot of talks about Ludwig, right? So you must have a couple of go-to use cases. Give us a couple of use cases that are not in Uber of Ludwig.
Interesting. Yeah. So at Uber, let's think about it. So I would say Uber is an organization.
Not at Uber.
Yeah. So I'm saying Uber is an organization that has a lot of machine learning use cases, from time series forecasting to text use cases to image use cases. So there's a lot of stuff. Right. It's hard to think of tasks that Uber wouldn't want to do, to be honest.
Right.
But I can imagine that there are things that
No. But I guess my question is, do you know of other companies using Ludwig?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. So there's
give us a couple of examples.
Yeah. So there's I know of, for instance, Freddie Mac is a company that I know is using Ludwig for, I don't know exactly the task that they're using it for. I can imagine that most of the tasks will be around, either prediction or kind of regression and classification tasks, I believe. I cannot be 100% sure, but there is other companies like Chatdesk is a company that's using Ludwig for, again, chatbot-like kind of capabilities and customer support things. I know of Music's Match is another company that uses Ludwig for, in particular, multimodal stuff with a mix of text and audio kind of features. I know for a fact that also Apple is another company that has integrated Ludwig in their internal platforms. I don't know the details of what they're using it for, but I know that it's part of their internal platforms. So there's a kind of breadth of different companies using it for several different tasks, some of which actually don't intersect with the ones that Uber does.
So when you were at Uber, you did a lot of NLP. So I imagine you used Ludwig for NLP.
Yes. For most of the tasks that we were...
so are these classic NLP tasks like classification?
So we use it for classification. We also used it for the modules in a dialogue system, for instance. We actually, back then, we released also another project called Plato that was basically doing the orchestration of different machine learning models, in particular Ludwig models, that were doing different pieces of the dialogue system pipeline. For instance, the NLU part was done with Ludwig, so Ludwig was predicting frames with intents and slots, but Ludwig was also used for doing state tracking. So, given the new frame of a turn and the previous information that we know from the previous turns, what is the current state of things that the dialogue system knows about. But it was also used for the generation of messages starting from those dialogue states to generate text that then was sent back to users. So Ludwig was used all across many different use cases within the dialogue realm. But yeah, these are
what is Ludwig's level of support for the Sesame Street models?
So this is actually something that we recently in version 0.3 added. So we have a history of collaboration with Hugging Face that, you know, we know them since like at least 3 years or something, even before they released the Transformers library. And we recently added, so in version 0.3, we recently added support for the full set of models that are provided by Hugging Face. So basically you can train a state-of-the-art Bert or Roberta or Electra kind of model within Ludwig, but just specifying that you want to encode your text input feature with Bert. Like you can say encoder colon Bert, and that's all you have to do to train a Sesame Street model on your data.
So imagine I'm interested in something specific, let's say time series forecasting. I come across a paper on Archive. The author's linked to a GitHub repo, but the code is in PyTorch. Oh no, but Ludwig is only in TensorFlow. What do I do then?
Yeah, so Ludwig, one thing that we are considering, and again, we really appreciate feedback from the community about it, is the possibility also to eventually add multiple backends. Right now we have TensorFlow 2 backend, and we are pretty happy with it. In particular, we moved from TensorFlow 1 to TensorFlow 2, and that allows us for a much more modular architecture. And so having additional backends in the future will be more simple. At the moment, if you are in that, you know, kind of...
Because a lot more researchers are using PyTorch, right?
Yeah, that is true. Right now, that's what, you know, the way that, in particular, the research community is going towards.
So,
but, you know,
so there's a high probability you'll come across a paper and the code will be in PyTorch.
That is true, yeah. At the same time, the interfaces between TensorFlow 2 and PyTorch are also converging to something that looks very similar. So adding a piece of code that is written in PyTorch to Ludwig by writing it in TensorFlow 2 will not be, you know, a huge endeavor, I believe. But again, the goal is eventually to provide with multi-backend kind of setting so that people can implement whatever model they want in whatever kind of backend they want. Also, we're also considering other solutions that are becoming even more popular right now with the research community, like for instance, JAX. We love JAX, and we would want to have, you know, a JAX kind of backend. All these things. So the Ludwig level of abstraction for the Ludwig user, in theory, that shouldn't matter that much. But again, we want to potentially have these things for the broader community to be able to contribute to Ludwig more easily.
So how would you characterize the demographics of Ludwig usage? Is it 50% research, 50% practical applications in production, or so? What's the split?
Yeah, so it's a little bit difficult for me to characterize that because of the fact that most of the interactions that I have are, and it's probably true with many you know, open source projects, most of the interactions that I have is with people that, you know, have questions or have issues, and so that I try to help them to solve those issues. I don't have a lot of visibility, unfortunately, on.
But can you tell if they're do they work in companies or do they work in labs, universities?
I think it's an interesting mix of. I would say most of the users that I see is from data scientists that work at companies.
Which is your target, right? Exactly.
Yeah. But at the same time, there's also, you know, I would say it's difficult to put a number, but I would say 60% or something like that, this demographic. But there's also, I would say at least 20% of researchers, like in particular researchers from fields that are not machine learning, that are actually because Ludwig makes it much easier for them. I have an interesting story with this researcher from the Max Planck Institute that is a biologist, and so was using Ludwig model trained on some biological and cell imaging, that it was telling me that it was not an expert in deep learning, but by using Ludwig, it was able to do this mix research with machine learning applied to biology that otherwise would have been difficult for him, for instance. So there is this kind of set of users. And then there is also the other set of users, which is more practitioners that are people that, you know, as you described before, train their models on their laptops. And
so if I'm like a scientist and I want to start playing around with Ludwig, it would help if it would be very convenient for me if it's very easy to run Ludwig in AWS or GCP or Azure. So what's the level of support for all the cloud providers?
So that's actually a very timely question, because it's one of the topics that we're discussing in the GitHub issues with users requesting this sort of things. So what users are particularly interested, more than on the training side, are on the serving side. So they really want to be able to, you know, deploy their Ludwig model on AWS, Azure, GCP. And it's a capability that right now is not there out of the box. But it's also true that what we provide is, you know, a Docker image that can spawn, basically spawns a REST API that serves the Ludwig model. And so the Docker image can be, you know, deployed in all this relatively easily in all these platforms. But I'm really looking forward also contributions from the community for, you know, making also that process of deploying this Docker image completely, you know, one command and that's it, right? That would be really nice for people to provide. In terms of training, on the other hand, we don't have something that is specific for each of those vendors, but to a certain extent, wherever you can train a TensorFlow model, you can also train a Ludwig model, because in the end, right now, what Ludwig does is training a TensorFlow model. So we believe that there's no real big blocker in for people to train a Ludwig model on those platforms.
So earlier you mentioned a sister Uber project, Horovod.
Yes.
And the big news around Horovod is now they're starting to use Ray.
Yeah.
Right? And so at the Ray Summit, the Horovod speaker mentioned that Ludwig is also going to be using Ray. And so I tweeted at you and you confirmed. So what's the breaking news here?
Yeah, let me give you the context on that. So you're speaking about Travis, who is a really good friend and also, you know, a collaborator. He's also a substantial contributor on Ludwig too. So he works on both projects. He's really, you know, really active on the open source community. Ludwig already integrates with Horovod, so that you can basically, you know, train distributed models in a distributed way very easily. We also want in the, you know, upcoming months to create a stronger tie with Ray as a project, so that there's at least 3 things that we want to do with Ray. One thing is, you know, training in a distributed way using Horovod's integration with Ray. So basically you have a Ray cluster and you have a Horovod that trains Ludwig model on all these machines. That's one. The other thing that we are thinking about doing is, because now we introduce this hyperparameter optimization in Ludwig, and there's a component in Ray, which is RayTune, which supports many different hyperparameter optimization algorithms, and in a really scalable way across, you know, the Ray cluster. We want to integrate that in our hyperparameter optimization, so that you can, you know, just choose the way you want to hyper-optimize. You can just say, you know, my executor is a Ray executor, and then it runs on a Ray cluster. And the third way that we are also looking into is pre-processing. We want to be able to also run pre-processing in a parallel way on a Ray cluster to speed up also data pre-processing. These are what we are looking into. We will see what we will end.
What's the timeline of the last 2?
So for the last 2, we hope that they will be there in the next major Ludwig release. I will say Ludwig is right now version 0.3, so we hope that they will be there in version 0.4. We don't have a strong
what's the cadence of release
Yeah, so up until now, we have been haven't been super disciplined with the cadence of releases. In some cases, like releases have been like 3 months away. In some cases, they've been 9 months away. So there's a huge variance there. What we're trying to do moving forward is to make each release smaller in scope, but at a faster cadence. So hopefully we hope to have, a 0.4 version out in like a 3 months, kind of 0.4 in 3 months, 0.5 in another 3 months. That's what we hope for. But, being it an open source project, it also depends on the involvement of the community. And, it's not 100% predictable the amount of time that it will take. But that's at least the goal that we're trying to set for ourselves.
By the way, I spoke with Max Pumperla, who's the maintainer of HyperOpt, and I asked him about HyperOpt and Tune, and he basically said if I were using a hyperparameter tuning right now in 2020, I would use Tune.
It's a really good product, and that is actually the reason why we want to integrate it.
Which I've never met an open source maintainer who endorsed another project, but that was pretty that was pretty interesting.
Open source maintainers are very
pragmatic
and also open to a certain extent, because everybody can see what everybody else is doing, and sometimes there are the ideas that cross-pollinate across different projects, and I think that's totally fine, because in the end, it's one of the advantages of working in the open. Right?
So, Piero, one of the things that I think sometimes ML people underappreciate is the importance of UX in some sense, right? So, meaning if you give the users the opportunity to interact with the system and make corrections and catch errors even, right? So then ultimately you end up with a better model. So what is Ludwig's philosophy around user interface and interaction? I know you have a command line interface, but how else can a user interact with the system?
Yeah, so there is, as you said, the command line interface that has a bunch of commands, sub-commands that you can do. You can train, you can predict, you can evaluate, you can also collect.
So I can see the output, right? So
you can also collect, you can see the outputs, you can collect the inner activations of the model, you can export your models, you can do all sorts of things.
But then can I see, oh, this model actually is biased, or this model underperforms with this type of data?
So what you can do is, Ludwig has a visualization component also, a visualization command that has, I don't remember exactly the number, but more than 20 different visualization commands that allow you to, if not having an understanding of what's going on inside the model, because that's having that understanding is kind of an open problem, but at least what it allows you to do is to compare different models and to compare different models in terms of the performance of those different models, but also in terms of the predictions that they're making. So, for instance, you could, have evaluations on some different subsets of your data if you want, and then compare different models on different subsets. These are all things that Ludwig allows you to do with just, those things are just one command away.
So, actually, as you were talking there, I guess I realized. So, to what extent do you think if you're not doing it yet, do you think it makes sense to have some sort of model explainability, Shapley, whatever type of approach somehow built into Ludwig?
So that's something that we are not doing at the moment.
Yeah.
But it's definitely something
because you have the visualizations, you say, right?
Yeah. We have the visualizations, and again, enriching that module with. So these visualizations right now are for, again, comparing performances and comparing predictions, but not for explaining those predictions. Adding to that some, Lime or sharp kind of capabilities to also have explainability would something that I would really want to have. Is just a matter of prioritization. Up until now, we haven't had we haven't prioritized that aspect yet, but we would be super happy to have community led efforts and PRs for that. It's something that we really care about, and I think it's something that will allow even a wider adoption of the tool, because of the fact that many people for many tasks for many tasks actually really need to have an understanding of why some decisions are made by the model. So
there are probably open source projects that you can integrate with,
definitely.
right?
Yeah, no, we want to integrate with other stuff. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. Absolutely, we want to integrate and import. I mean, for instance, for Sharp, there is like you can import the Python package for that.
So this is a question I ask every open source project leader. What metrics do you care most about besides GitHub stars?
Well,
so when you're sitting down with the other Ludwig people, so what are you folks tracking?
So there are some. So one metric. I mean, it's not really. It's more a qualitative thing than a strict metric, really. But it is about issues. Issues are like a double-edged sword to a certain extent, because you want to have the minimum amount possible because you want to product to and your project to work well and not having many issues, right? On the other hand, issues are also a signal of the usage of the project. So you want to have let's say an healthy amount of issues. And another important thing, in my opinion, is that how fast can you solve those issues, in particular the ones that are bugs or fixes. I think you also want to be relatively fast at solving the feature requests. So to adapt your project with respect to what the community is looking for in terms of new features. But I believe as a maintainer, I feel the urge to solve as fast as I can bugs that pop up, just because I want my users to have the best experience possible. And so how fast can I be in solving those issues is, although if it's a little bit tricky number to track, in general, on a qualitative way, that's something that I strive for, trying to make it as easy, as fast as possible, and have user happy with the speed of the resolution of their issues. That's one important aspect. Other important aspects are, I also strive for trying to make it so that users will have, again, it's something that is difficult to do, but I try to make, let's say, the more I have users producing like materials, like could be like tutorials, could be videos, could be anything like that, the happier I am, because producing introductory material for the project is something that I try to do. I have an extensive example section and also a getting started guide on documentation, all these sort of things. But being mostly like one person maintainer and a relatively small amount of core contributors, finding the time for doing that is very difficult. And so it's something that I encourage, but at the same time, seeing people doing it reinforces for me the idea that I'm doing a good job at explaining the project and also at making it usable by people, because it means that they don't even need to ask me how to do things. They can just do them themselves and show other people how to do. So that's something that on one hand makes me really happy, and on the other hand, it's a good signal that what I'm doing is worth for people.
I can tell you that the scikit-learn people treat their documentation as seriously as their code.
That's something that I can relate with.
Yeah,
I think their community is much bigger than ours, so they have a little bit an easier time to do that. But I think that values.
Let's say you want to bring in a model into their project, they will scrutinize your documentation as much as your code.
Yeah, no, I can totally relate with that, and I think it's a really valuable lesson to learn from a really wonderful project.
So you must instrument your docs, so you have Google Analytics, so you know what people are reading and what they're interested in, right?
I'm not. So
you should.
I probably should. I am. I'm on the fence with this thing, so I totally see the value of doing something like that. On the other hand,
and you can tell what countries people are from too. Like,
again, at the moment I don't, and I see the value in doing that.
Yeah.
There is one thing that I hate about every single website on the web, which is the pop-up window that shows you, oh, we are tracking your cookies. I want to avoid tracking users as much as possible, and in particular to give, to set cookies and things like that. On the other hand, I know that there are also some open source solutions that are really transparent in the way they do tracking. And so I think I want to try to find a solution that is as respectable, respecting as possible of users' privacy, but at the same could give me some insight on what is more valuable. There is, for instance, a project that I really like. It's called Orbit Love. That is a project that allows you to, keep track of your community on GitHub, know something about your users, again, in a way that is respectful of their privacy, and engage in conversations with your community that make it possible for you to have an understanding of what's going on. Because again, I don't want to spy on my users, absolutely, but if I know that they all care about one specific aspect of the library, well, I will spend more time on making that aspect better. Right?
So how do you interact with users? You're probably going to say Slack, right?
So
I have an opinion about this, so you go ahead. Yeah.
So we're actually not using Slack at the moment. We're using an open source solution called Zulip.
Okay.
It's similar to Slack. It has some more advanced capabilities, in my opinion. So for some aspects, it's more advanced. For some others, it's a little bit less advanced. But
so let me give you my Slack rant. I think a lot of open source projects are using Slack, which is great, because one, it gives you immediate feedback if the core community is active. It's almost like having tech support, right? So you can get immediate feedback. I mean, a couple of main drawbacks. One, it's not indexable. So a lot of users who are on Google are not going to see all of this valuable knowledge that's being passed around inside Slack. Secondly, a lot of communities don't have the money to pay the license as the number of users grow. So then not only is it not indexable, it's not even archived. So a lot of knowledge is lost. Right?
So yeah, so again, I agree with your assessment.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons why we like Zulip, for instance, is because it is an open source project. It has also a hosted paid version, but those fees are not applied to open source projects. So that's it's the way they have to give back to the open source community, which is something that I appreciate. As an open source maintainer, is something that I really appreciate. But there's a second aspect to what you're saying, which is the discoverability of the solutions that have already been found, right? So
I don't know about you, but if you ever use an open source project, it throws off an error message. Sometimes you just copy and paste that error message, right? And miraculously, the answer to your question will surface.
I totally relate with that. And so what I try to use the chat for is not really for tech support or issues kind of things, is more for conversations. And if there is like a new feature that we want to add, we want to ask opinions to people. For those sort of things, I think the chat is good. And also for checking in with people, maybe contributors that are working on a specific thing, to checking in with them, what's the status, to get everybody on the same page. For those things, the chat is great. I believe that for those, more tech support kind of cases, forum-like things are more, better suited for that. And we also have Git queue page for that, which is, again, it's kind of basically a forum attached to the GitHub page, literally, which is, those conversations can also happen in the GitHub issues, really. In some cases, they happen there.
Yep.
But, this is sometimes that's not great for a maintainer, because you want to have the issues be issues or things that you have it's like, a to-do list for you to a certain extent.
Right,
You don't want the conversations to be there. If those discussions are more on this Git queue thing, for us is better. But to be honest, what happens is that the users end up posting their things whatever they see fit, really. We try to drive them towards one specific of these options, but users do what they want.
Right. So there are now several projects out of Uber that our listeners have heard of. So the first one that came out was Michelangelo, which is their machine learning platform. There's Horovod, there's Ludwig, there's Pyro. So, but realistically, Piero, if I'm a new data scientist at Uber, which of these tools am I likely to be using?
So it kind of depends on the kind of things that you do, but I can say to a certain extent, you may end up using all of them, and for different goals, obviously. So Michelangelo is like the internal machine learning platform. It's not an open source project, although
that everyone uses, right? Is that right?
Yeah, everyone uses. It is particularly suited for serving models, but also has components for training models. Up until a certain moment in time, they were more focused on non-deep learning use cases. Up until I was part of Uber, they were also adding more and more deep learning capabilities to their platform. So it's particularly well suited for kind of large scale deployment level things, rather than for really quick iteration and experimentation. On the other hand, Ludwig is particularly well suited for these comparison across different models, experimentation, adding new features, trying out different things. That's
But then you work in Ludwig, and then you'd have to deploy in Michelangelo.
Yeah. So for instance, Michelangelo is has a really easy way to deploy in Europods. And so Ludwig exports as neuropods. So there's a bridge there that is pretty, easy for customers to use, really, for instance. There's also other potential ways, but that's the main path for deployment.
And then Horovod is only for people who need distributed training, basically.
Yeah, Horovod is particularly well suited for people who are training big tasks with a lot of data. And so where data parallelism is really, brings you value. And Horovod is used by both Michelangelo and also by Ludwig for training. So those things interoperate really well. While Pyro is a little bit of a different kind of tool.
Is it more research, or is it actually used?
It is used, but I would say it's more research oriented, to the extent that the kind of things that you can do with Pyro are mostly around probabilistic programming languages, which are, again, a more research-oriented topic that has not seen yet a huge industry and deployment adoption as much as deep learning models have seen so far. But on the other hand, they are very, very useful for some specific use cases, in particular when you want to have, in particular, the interaction between deep learning models and different variable models, those kind of things. For those kind of things, Pyro is very well suited. And also for doing variational inference and all sort of really advanced machine learning use cases, Pyro is very well suited for those use cases.
So let's close with this question, which is basically, so you created Ludwig for yourself, and then you kind of released it within a small circle of people in Uber, and then it grew within Uber. So is it fair to say then, Piero, that by the time you open source Ludwig, it's clear that it was going to take off, no? Well, you already had validation inside Uber.
Yeah, so I had the validation that it was useful for tasks that were beyond my immediate tasks. That's for sure.
Right.
The trajectory was positively suggesting that there would be, even more use cases and even more people that would use it. To be honest, right now the project is doing pretty well. It's past, I think, past 7,000, approaching 8,000 stars on GitHub. I was not expecting, to be honest, that much interest from the community. I'm really happy to see that, and I'm also really happy to see that kind of translated into more people getting involved with the project and helping me out, and that led to improvements in Ludwig and new features that I was not hoping for at the beginning. So it was, I believe that that's true about.
But as I recall it, when you gave your talk, I mean, people were excited pretty early, right?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I hope that they are, they're keeping excited. In particular with the new release, I really hope that people are keeping excited about the project.
No, I think why people are really love the project is it really, as you say, abstracts away a lot of the things that you may not need to know about or want to do. If you're, especially if you're in a company wanting to move fast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
And
perfect. Prototyping is perfect, I believe.
yeah. And with that, thank you, Piero.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Ben. It was a really nice conversation. Hope to talk to you soon.